So this section, let us focus upon JDBC User Details Manager. And what we do is now we were using loading the data using in memory. I want to take these details from a database now. So right now I am going towards Postgres SQL. I already have set it up. So I will add up my username, password, and let me simply just create a new database and let me call it as CWZ security. It's not security required, but because I'm creating a section on security, I make a security database. So once I have this database, what I need to do is I have a script ready. What I'll do is in my resource directory, I will create a folder by name SQL, and SQL will have a file called as script.sql. And in my script.sql, I will copy a script which I have created and which is in line with my application which is required. So what I do, I have got table users, authorities. I'll explain you these tables. Then I have to enter this value. So I don't remember what are this bcrypt value. Let us quickly create those new bcrypt value. So for code with Z, I just make it short. I say CWZ at 12345. Okay. So if I say encrypt, I'll do what? I will replace this value for admin user. So this is my admin user. I replace it here. And my normal user, I have got CWZ at 123. And that is 12345. So I'll simply say CWZ at, let me just write something else. Let's make it easier. ABC at 123, which is my, but it will again be blocked by my no op. So let me call it as CWZ at ABC, and it is my read property. And in my admin table as well, let me just take this exact one and add up. So why am I taking this much effort? Because then I can simply run this in one go. So you need to remember one thing, that there are multiple other tables. For this particular part, I'm only interested for users and authorities. And for this bcrypt, my password is what? CWZ at 123 4 and 5. So I copy this whole script. Okay. I go to Postgre. I right click, open for query tool, paste it here, my whole query, and I run this script. So if you check after executing this script inside your schemas, inside your tables, there should be three tables for now: users, authorities, and customers. So why am I creating this customers and authorities table? So I've got happy at example and admin at example. That was my previous one, but here I have got user and admin. User is what? No org password in org at 12345, and then admin is what? A bcrypt with CWZ at 12345. So we have got two different username passwords here for different admin, different user. That was setting up the database. That is how we set up my database. Let me add a simple commit here. I'll say added SQL scripts and ran on Postgres. So I commit this, push it. Perfect. Next, what I want to do is, because I want to connect with Postgres and I will have to create some XML like dependencies on top of this. So I will require JDBC, JPA, and Postgres dependency. So I will copy paste those dependencies from my solution file and I run my Maven build. So this way, these three dependencies are added up in my application as well. And in my application.properties, I'll have to give certain settings now. What are the settings? Spring dot data source dot URL is equal to JDBC colon PostgreSQL colon // localhost colon 5432, which is its port number, and then CWZ hyphen security is the name of my database. Then I say spring dot user is what? Postgres. Spring user dot password. Sorry, it's user, not user and name. It is username, and it is not for spring dot security. It is spring dot data source dot username. My bad. And spring dot data source dot passwords. My password is admin for database. Then I'll say spring uh, show SQL is, I will set it to true so I know what queries are getting fired. Plus we have to specify our dialect now. So spring dot data dot JPA properties. So data spring dot JPA dot properties dot hibernate dot dialect is because we are writing with Postgres. I will say org dot hibernate dot dialect dot PostgreSQL dialect. Then spring dot data dot JPA properties dot hibernate. Okay, so I've got properties dot format SQL is true. So it will tell me how do we use those formations. So this is true. After I make these changes and I reload my application, let's see if my terminal is showing that we are connected or we don't have any error here. Okay, this is cannot invoke because the return value for transaction execution line helper is null. Okay, but apart from that, I don't think there is any issue here. Okay, so I have got connected with my database Postgre SQL dialect. Yeah. org hibernate dialect.postgresql dialect, and my format SQL is true. Show SQL is also set to true. Admin and my user. Okay, here it might be the problem. So my username is equal to this. I reload, and I hope this will resolve my error. Yeah. So my dependencies are sorted now with application.properties. Let's make up a commit. So we added the dependencies and properties related to JDBC and SQL. Oh shit. So your code is also, if you're following along, you can just go and check the commit histories for this particular commits, and you will be able to follow along till this point. So now that we have got the dependencies for JPA and JDBC, next step is let's create our own, like rather than getting the records from in user. So I'll go to my config now here, and in my config, you can see that my users are getting loaded from here. I don't want this anymore. I will comment it off. I say, let's change this. And for that reason, we have got a JDBC user details manager. So for adding a JDBC user details manager, what we can do is just add up a bean here, which says public user details service. Okay, that is fine. But this one, when you deal with JDBC, it will take you the object of data source. It will take the object of data source, and this data source is actually coming from, where is it? Java x.sq. So I take the data source and I say return new JDBC user details manager, and I pass that data source to it. So now it will be responsible for configuring. Now here I'm using the default properties. See, if I go to JDBC user details manager, this is like we had got in memory user details manager. I have got JDBC user details manager. And if you see the queries, you'll understand why I created query by the name of users, authorities, because this is expecting that you have a table by name user, which has username, password, and enabled, whether this user is enabled or not. And then in authorities where I've got username and authority. So this way, what we are doing is we go to the config, we tell them this is what I want to deal with. That's it. This is the minimal configuration which is required when we are working with the JDBC details manager. I run my code again. If you see my code and if I see the output tables for users, so let's say view my data here. So I have two users. One is user, which is using inorg at 12345. And then we have got admin with CWZ at 12345. Let me go back, clear my history, and go for loads. It will ask me where is it. So I will say user and in org at 12345. Enter. And it is allowing me to log in. And you can, is it printing my query? I don't think so. Access was denied earlier, but it is now working properly. I had another user. I will do what is clear my history again and reload. Let me clear the data first. I reload. This time I say admin and I now say CWZ at 12345. This is decrypted password. So which got decrypted behind the pictures, and see, as simple as that. But here only problem is you are bound by what exactly these data tables are given to you. It's fine. If it's a small application, this is fine, but not work in every application. So what we have done is we have added JDBC user details manager. We have added user details manager. I push it to the repo till this point and I close off. Yeah, it's a lot of chaotic here now. So I go back. Next, what I plan is every time it's not going to be the case that you will be using these user tables. What if a user have their own table by the name of customer who has ID, email, password, and role? Yeah, ID, email, PWD. Let's say they want to create by their own, and then we have got role. And inside this table, I have already added 2-3 records. So if you see, we have got records like happy at example.com and admin at example.com. So we can check this out, like what exactly these people are doing. CWZ at ABC is the password for happy. Now, I don't want you to connect with the previous one. Like I don't want to use the inbuilt. So I do what? I go back and I create my own user detail service. Yeah, I want to create a custom user details manager. So for that reason, I will have to create my own service, which will be implementing what user detail service. And this user detail service have a function, which is what load user by username. So in this situation, it will be email. Let us start structuring our application first. Let me go to my package, call this as mod. In my model, let me create a class by name customer. In my customer, what I do, I mark it with what at entity. I mark it with what my table, where the name of my table is what customer. Then I have got private long ID. Then I have got private string email. I have got private string PWD, which is my password. And then I have got private string of role. I've got this multiple codes here. And what I do is first thing, let us mark this as what at ID, because we need this ID here in the persistence. Then I have got generated value, where my strategy is generation type of identity. So it will be created here. Then for the last column, I want to specifically tell that my column name is what role. Yeah, my column name is what role. And let's bring Lombok in action. So I say I want to generate getter and all the setter. I want to generate this particular customer class. So if you want, you can generate the setter getters if you're not comfortable with Lombok. Then I create a package. Let me call this package as what? Repositories or repository. Under my repository, I create a new Java class. Let us call it as an interface. And in this interface, I will write what? It is nothing but customer repository. Okay. And this customer repository actually extends JPA repository for customer and log. Yeah, you have to specify what name, what customer, and what is the type of your primary key. So this will by default give you those basic functions like save all, get by ID, get everything, and so on. What I'm interested in here is I want to write a optional customer find by email. Yeah, optional customer. I can also write it by find customer by. Yeah, I will use the convention from Spring Boot, both of them Spring JPA. So it will do what? Because I will be using to load a customer by email, which does not come as the basic part. And I will also mark this as what? Repository. So now what happens? I have got a repository created for customer, which will give me any customer which is loaded. Next, I do what? I go and create in my config. I will create my own detail service. So this is the place where I'm overriding my detail service by myself. I am telling them, okay, I'm taking charge. I don't want in memory or JDBC. I want to take care of this by myself. So let's go back in my config. Let me call this as Java class and code with Z details service. Okay. And in this detail service, what I do, add service. I'm going to mark this as service. But for this to be implemented as service, it need to implement user detail service. Yeah, it need to implement the user detail service. And this user detail service have a function which we will implement. Which one is that? Load user by username. We have seen this already. Load user by username. So this is the place where I tell them, rather than you checking it there out, let me give you the customer, whatever user customer is there, I will create it out of my customer object. So I have got this user details object which I need to return. But the object I have is my customer. So what will I do? Load the customer first. So I say customer is equal to customer repository. So for getting that customer repository, I'll have to use the auto wiring here now. So I say repository, customer repository, and let me use it inside a constructor and mark it as at auto wired. So I have got my customer repository now. So customer repository dot find customer by email, and this is nothing but my username which I am getting from the function. So I say username. Then what I do, if the customer is found is fine, or else throw. Yeah, or else throw. So here we throw an exception. What is that exception? We say new username not found exception, which is an inbuilt exception. Okay, and I specify user not found for plus username. Yeah, it says user is not found for this username. No need of semicolon here. Okay. Then if the customer is found, what I do, I say list of granted authority. List of granted authority. Now list of granted authorities will give me what? Okay. It will give me the list of authorities I have. So I say authorities is equal to, and I say list dot of, and what do I say is I will add up that inside this list new simple granted authority which takes a string. So I'll say customer object dot get role, whatever role you have added. So if I check my database, see the role here is what? Read, and here is admin. Yeah, we'll talk more of right now. It's not doing any work in our code. I will come back to that. And then I do what? Return new user object where I have got customer dot get email, customer dot get password, which is PWD, and the authorities object which we have created, which will be connected with my user details. So if you check the documentation for user, it implements user details. That is why user can be passed to user details. So if I go back, I am passing the object of user and it is expecting what user details, which is fine. I'm overriding this function and now I tell them this is what I am planning to do when I want to create a user. So this time I rerun my application and I'm asking them, please do not use the JDBC ones. So for that reason, also, do you think so? We'll need to make some changes. Yeah. The change I need to make is what I need to go to my config and I also need to comment this now because earlier we were asking, okay, please use JDBC. Now I'm telling them don't use JDBC. I have registered a bean called as code with Z service here. And one thing I forgot to add up here in my detail service is I require an all arg constructor. So at required arguments constructor, add required argument constructor. So that is fine. And I rerun my application. Once I rerun my application, okay, I enable it. Now, if I go back, same thing. Let's clear the history. Let's clear the history. Now I reload. This time, this login will happen through what? From my database, from my customer table. It is already happening through database, but this time we'll do what? Happy at example.com and password is what? CWZ at ABC. I say enter and see. It's working perfectly fine. No problem. I'm really happy to see this happening, and it's a good point where we make a commit. So I can make a commit that we have added a custom user details manager. So the next step, what I want to do is I want to create a controller for registering a user so that I can register the user by myself. And I say customer controller. In my customer controller, let us mark it as what? REST controller. I want to create a function which is called as what? Register, and I will make use of customer repository, customer repository, and also I want to make a password encoder as password encoder, and then create a constructor for customer repository, which sorry, customer controller, which takes an object of customer repository, comma, password encoder, and then I can say what this dot customer repository is equal to customer repository, and this dot password encoder is password encoder. Okay, I have created this two things, and then I say what all of these are what beans, so I can simply just say AutoWire. After I'm done with this, what is the next thing I do? I say public response entity. I need to specify a response entity here, and I say string, and I want to say what it is my register user. And when I want to register a user, you need to pass me a request body of customer, which I'm getting from the front end. And here I will mark it as a at post mapping for slash register. After my post mapping for slash register, what I do next? Let's try, and we need to create this. So first I need to get my password. So I'll say string hashed password is equal to whatever is my password encoder dot encode what whatever I get from the customer dot get password. See, I can apply some checks also, but I'm more focused on security this point, so I'll keep there. And then I say customer dot set password is I'll set up the hashed password. Okay. Once I set up my hashed password, then I say customer saved customer is equal to customer repository dot save the customer object. So I save this. If I say if my saved customer dot get ID is greater than 0, that means the customer was returned successfully. So I will simply say return HTTP. Sorry, I will return response entity dot status is what HTTP status dot created, which will set it to 201 dot body, and in the body I will say given customer details are stored successfully. Okay. Then if this is not the case, then I'll say what else. If the ID is not there, then I say it's a bad request, user registration has failed. So I'll say return response entity dot status HTTP status dot bad request. It will give me what 400, and then I can say dot body customer registration failed. This is good. I return. Then I have my try block, which I'll write a catch block for. And in my catch, if any exception also occurred now, I can simply return response entity dot status HTTP status dot internal server error, which is 500 error code, and then dot body for an exception occurred plus ex dot get message. So it will give me the message as well. And this pretty much sums up our registration. I have written the registration implementation. And what I need to do now, because if I want to register a customer, if it is if it is behind the authenticated line, it will not be done. So I'll have to add this in where, because I have added a new API, I will say I want this to be in permit all. So I'll say register. This is my register post. I start it. Okay, this is perfect. And what I need to do is when I make the call, Spring Security now, this time, let me create a new request for add a customer, basically register a customer rather than saying add. Let's say register a customer. This is going to be a post call http colon slash slash localhost colon 8080 slash register. And in my body, I will pass on a JSON where what are the two basic requirements? I have got email. Okay. Let's say I pass my email at zartav at codewithz.org, and pwd password is I'll pass zartav at 123, which will eventually do my work. And let me also pass a role here, that my role is read role, and I send this request. See, it came back with 403, which is something I was expecting. But till this point, what we have done, we have created a controller. So I will commit here, added customer register controller, but it is failing with 403. Okay. Let's see why that fails with 403. So you see our current application is failing because of cross-site request forgery issue. Normally what happens when you try to, let's try to understand what is CSRF first. So a typical cross-site request forgery attack aims to perform an operation in web application on behalf of a user without their explicit consent. So consider a website netflix.com and attacker's website is travelblog.com. Also assume the victim is logged in and his session is being maintained by cookies. So what will attacker do now? They will find out what action they need to perform to connect to Netflix, and it will place the HTML code on the website travelblog.com, and which will imitate a legal request to netflix.com. So they are trying for a post request. This is important here, that whenever they try to do, they will always check for any post type of request, post, put, delete sort of request. Okay. So you see what does the CSRF does. So user login into an application, we get the session cookies. Now what will user do? It will access that session and it will try to append that cookies and send it to the server. So there are multiple ways to implement CSRF protection. And what is exactly happening right now is your Springboard is securing you because you are doing a post call. It might think that someone else is trying to make that call. So you first thing you need to handle the CSRF. But right now I'm not in the plan to do that. What will I do is I will go back. So now what we need to do is I will go into my config, and here I will have to specifically disable CSRF. Okay, so I have made you explain about the issue. Now what I do is in my HTTP, before I do the authorization of the request, I will also say .csrf, and here I will simply do what CSRF config, or let me just call it as CSRF config. So it takes an object of CSRF config object, and using this object, I will simply just disable it. So I'll say config dot disable for now. For now, yeah, this is important, and I'm just doing it for a minute. Okay. So this is also no that let's keep it the way it was. This is easier to read. So I'm disabling my CSRF config, and I restart my application. If I go back to my application now through the postman, now I make the call this time. See, my request has been added successfully. So Zartab code with z.org and Zartab 123. If I check my customer table, I will have one more, and it is already encrypted as well. And I can use that for login now. So if I do Control H, delete my history, and if I reload it here, now I say Zartab code with z.org. Password is Zartab123. Okay, what I provided password. The password is compromised, it says. So let me do what? Let me delete this from the backend itself quickly, and we'll use some different password. A lot of people using my name. So delete from users or delete from customer where ID is equal to 3. Okay. I execute the query. And now when I execute this one, it says I've got only 2. Let me use some different password. So I say Zartab 321, send it, added user. If I say Zartab code with z.org and Zartab 321, now it's loaded. And this is basically we have shifted from our regular application development to the custom one, and we have done that completely. So we disabled CSRF to access the register API. Now the next part where we want to focus is about overriding your authentication provider as well. So authentication provider, if I talk to you about authentication provider, you remember this diagram, right? Now in this diagram, you saw we have got authentication manager, which we are using anyhow. Then we got user details manager, password encoder. I have got this authentication manager and authentication provider. So what am I doing is I am going right now what is happening behind the pictures. This authentication provider is inbuilt and it is taking care of the username password checking. I don't want to do that. I want to go ahead and check those things by myself. So first thing, how are your password and things checked? We need to see that. So by default in Spring Security, you pass your username password. It will load the data from username. Now you know where it is coming from, right? When we say load the data from username, this is the function which is getting called. Bring in the user details. Then what happens next? It will try to match it here, and if it is there, it will success or it will be failure. But we have got encoders. We have seen that. Then now we got the hashing algorithms where we pass the hash data, we get the details, and we cross check with the hash details. But now we have also got the concept of authentication provider. This can be multiple. So right now we'll just take username and password. But if you know how you can override that tomorrow, if you want to switch it to let's say iris or fingerprint, or you want to accept it using OTP code. So authentication provider in security take care of the authentication logic. Remember, this is a very important keyword. What does it do? It takes care of your authentication logic. It can be basic implementation of username, password. It's fine. It can be anything. So only thing you need to do what you need to write your own authentication logic by implementing the authentication provider interface. So for doing that, we have an interface called as authentication provider, and we need to that has a method called as authenticate. And here you remember which is returning me back an object of what authentication, which is returning back an object of authentication. You remember from the first slide we spoke that authentication is nothing but a reference of the user which we are using in our application, right? It represents the user we are dealing with. So if you remember this is something we are going to use now. So I go back to my config. In my config, first thing I need to do what is I will say I have my own authentication provider. So in my config, I write a new Java class. Let me call it as code with Z authentication provider. In my code with Z authentication provider, I implements authentication provider. And in my authentication provider, I implement the methods. There are two methods, authenticate and supports. I'll say give me body for both. I want this to be loaded. So this is going to be a component for me so that Spring Boot recognizes it. And I say it required all our constructor. Plus, it requires two things here. First is your user details service. Now you know, see user details service, and then the next thing I will mark it as what auto had at auto wired. It's not a good practice to use it on the property, but just in interest of time, I am doing this. So let's say password encoder, and here I have got what again auto wired. Now, if you go and look for user detail service, you have already overridden that and released as your own service. So this is what will be returned. And then you have your password encoder, which is coming from here, right? That what is the default password encoder, it will be returned from here. So here, I in my authentication, I need to write the logic. So I write my own logic when a user should be authenticated and not. So for that reason, what I say, string username is equal to authentication dot get name. So here I will get my username. Then I have got string password is equal to authentication dot get credentials dot toString. So it will return me the password here. Then I do what? I create a user details object. So I say user details is equal to user details service dot load by username, and I pass my username here. So it will go and bring the username for me. What it is doing, in fact, it will actually go and not this one, but it will call this load user by username, and it will get the user details which will contain the data from my customer. Yeah, it will contain the data from my customer because this is one which will be getting executed behind the pictures. After I get that, then I say if my password encoder dot matches. What does it matches? The password which I received, comma, user details dot password. I'm going to get from the backend. So I say okay dot matches pwd and user details dot get password. So that means this has been logged in, and then I say what, return new username password authentication token. This is inbuilt, yeah, which is returning, which will be added now. So I say username, comma, password, comma, user details dot get authorities. These are three things which will return. See, if I go and check the documentation for user name, the password authentication token. So what does this class mean? It's an authentication implementation that is designed for simple presentation of username and password. Basically, what we call as principal and credentials. Yeah. So we have got the credentials, we have got the principal, and we are creating this to be setting authentication to be true. So if I go back and now it returns this value, else it will throw bad exception. Else it throw new bad credentials exception, which will be what, invalid, let's say password or something like that. And then we also have a supports. So we have to specify what type it supports. So I'll say username password authentication token dot class dot is assignable from, and it is assignable from the authentication object we have got. So this is what we return. Yeah. This is what we return, and we are overriding the authentication provider. Yeah, we are basically overriding the authentication provider, telling them, okay, this is what I want to implement in my application. So there is one place where it is an error. Is that yet an error somewhere? If I reload my application, so output is basically going to be same. You don't need to worry about that. Line 33, yeah, invalid password. If I run this, so here things are going to be exactly same. Try to log in, like register, it's already registered with 321. If I go back and delete the history for last 1 hour and so, and if I try to access loans again, if I say zartavat, 4 with z.org, and password is zartavat21. See, it's working, but this time the things are getting authenticated from my authentication provider. So the overall aim for overwriting this was to tell you tomorrow if you want to write your own logic here, you can anytime write it. Yeah, but you should know where to do that.